Welcome to the channel. Today we delve into a harrowing case of deception, greed, and a betrayal that stunned the public. The story of beloved author Helen Bailey. Helen Bailey was 51 years old, recently engaged, and looking ahead to a new phase of her life. She was planning her wedding, enjoying quiet days at home, and spending most of her time with her dog, Boris. From the outside, things seemed settled and happy. But behind that picture, something was already going wrong. Just as Helen was starting to move forward and open herself up to love again, she was betrayed by the person closest to her. What should have been a hopeful future would instead turn into a story driven by greed, one that ended in her death and left everyone who knew her searching for answers. On April 11, 2016, in the small town of Royston in Herefordshire, Helen Bailey disappeared. She was a well-known author, best recognized for the Electric Brown children's book series, and her sudden absence was immediately worrying. 4 days later, her fiancé, 55-year-old Ian Stewart, reported her missing. He told police that Helen was gone without any explanation and her dog, Dachshund Boris, was gone too. Stewart said he had found a note from Helen. According to him, she had decided to go to their holiday home in Broadstairs to be alone for a while. At first, the story didn't sound impossible. Helen was known to take time for herself, especially when writing or working through her grief. She valued quiet and reflection. But as the days went by, doubts started to grow. Helen wasn't answering calls. No one had seen her or Boris, and the people who knew her best felt something wasn't right. Slowly, concern turned into suspicion. What they didn't yet know was that Helen's disappearance would lead to a shocking discovery, one rooted in betrayal, money, and murder. Helen Bailey was born on August 22, 1964, in Northumberland, England. She grew up in a supportive family and showed an interest in writing early on. At one point, she wanted to become a forensic scientist and studied psychology at Thames Polytechnic. Eventually, she shifted paths, moving into media and marketing. She worked on well-known children's shows, including Rugrats and Garfield. In 1996, Helen married John Sinfield, who ran a licensing rights company. They built a happy life together, one that came to a sudden end in February 2011. While on vacation in Barbados, John drowned while swimming. His death devastated Helen. In the years that followed, she poured her grief into writing. She started a blog called Planning Grief, where she spoke openly about loss, pain, and learning how to keep going. The blog struck a chord with many people who were grieving themselves, and it gave Helen a sense of purpose during an incredibly difficult time. It was through this blog that she met Ian Stewart, someone who would later become central to her story. By the time she disappeared, Helen was financially secure. Her assets were valued at more than £3 million, and she also had a life insurance policy worth $1.8 million. It was a detail that would later take on a far more troubling significance. Helen's financial security would later become a major focus of the investigation into her disappearance and death. She owned valuable properties in both Royston and Broadstairs, and she planned to leave them to Ian. She trusted him completely. Helen Bailey and Ian Stewart first connected in October 2011 through Helen's blog, Planning Grief. Both had lost their spouses, and their early conversations were about coping, loneliness, and trying to move forward. Over time, that shared experience turned into a close friendship and eventually a romantic relationship. When they decided to build a life together, their families came with them. Ian had 2 adult sons from his previous marriage, and Helen brought her dog Boris, who was a constant presence in her life. From the outside, they looked like a couple settling into a future, planning their wedding, sharing a home, and blending their families. But the relationship wasn't as straightforward as it appeared. Behind closed doors, there were tensions, especially around money. Those issues would later sit at the center of the investigation into Helen's disappearance and death. Helen's trust in Ian was clear. She named him as a beneficiary in her will and gave him control over her finances, choices that would later prove critical to understanding what happened between them. Helen was last seen on April 15, 2016 in Royston, Hertfordshire. That day, she was busy planning her wedding to Ian, visiting venues and talking excitedly about what was ahead. Later in the afternoon, she left Ian a note saying she needed some time alone and planned to go to their holiday home in Broadstairs, but investigators soon confirmed she never arrived there. Her disappearance immediately raised concern. It didn't match who Helen was at that point in her life. She was focused on her work, deeply attached to her dog, and genuinely looking forward to getting married. The note, along with her movements that day, quickly became key pieces of the investigation. Witnesses later reported seeing Helen walking Boris between 3:40 and 3:50 p.m. on April 11th. That sighting would become the last confirmed moment she was seen in public. Tensions soon turned to Ian Stewart. His claim that Helen had simply left on her own didn't sit well with her family and friends. They described her as responsible, devoted to her writing, and unlikely to disappear without telling anyone, especially without her dog. As police dug deeper, inconsistencies in Ian's account began to surface. What initially looked like a partner left behind slowly revealed something much darker as investigators uncovered troubling details about Ian's behavior and possible motives following Helen's disappearance in April 2016. At first, police didn't treat Helen's disappearance as urgent. She was an adult and she had left a note saying she needed some time alone. The note mentioned she might go to their holiday home in Broadstairs, so officers believed she would likely turn up on her own. But as the days passed and no one heard from Helen, concerns started to grow. Her family and friends kept stressing the same thing. This wasn't like her at all. She stayed. She didn't just disappear. That pressure led police to take a closer look. Ian Stewart officially reported Helen missing on April 15th, which marked a shift in the investigation. Officers, along with volunteers, began searching the area. They went door to door, speaking with neighbors and asking if anyone had seen Helen or her dog. Search teams also checked nearby parks and walking paths, places Helen was known to visit regularly with Boris. Witnesses later came forward and said they had seen Helen walking Boris between 3:40 and 3:50 in the afternoon on April 11th. That would turn out to be the last confirmed time she was seen in public. Despite the growing search effort, nothing concrete surfaced at first. With no clear explanation for where Helen had gone or why, investigators began to consider that this might be more than a simple disappearance. That shift allowed police to look more closely at Ian Stewart and the details of his account. As time went on, his version of events began to change. Small inconsistencies started to appear, enough to raise serious questions about what he knew and when he knew it. Then, technical evidence added a new layer to the case. On April 16th, police discovered that Helen's phone had connected to the Wi-Fi network at the couple's holiday cottage in Kent. This stood out for two key reasons. First, it challenged Ian's claim that Helen had gone there on her own. Second, it raised questions about Ian's movements during the days after she was reported missing. Prosecutors would later argue that this Wi-Fi connection suggested Ian had been at the cottage after Helen disappeared, possibly trying to make it look like she had traveled there herself. Around the same time, investigators examined Helen's financial records and noticed another troubling detail. On the day Helen vanished, Ian increased the standing order from her personal bank account into their joint account from £400 a month to £4,000. It was a move that added weight to growing suspicions and pushed the investigation in a very different direction. That sudden jump in payments immediately stood out to investigators. It suggested a deliberate attempt to access Helen's money without her knowledge, and it introduced a clear financial motive for her disappearance. Police also learned that shortly after Helen went missing, Ian tried to gain power of attorney over her finances. At a time when no one knew where she was, that move raised serious concerns about his intention to take control of her assets. Investigators uncovered more troubling digital evidence. Not long after Helen disappeared, Ian had searched online for information about disposing of a body and details related to life insurance policies. Those searches added weight to growing suspicions about his mindset and behavior in the days following her disappearance. Taken together, the financial activity, phone data, and online searches painted a clearer picture. They didn't just link Ian Stewart to Helen's disappearance. They suggested planning and actions that appeared to take place after she was gone. This combination of evidence became a turning point in the investigation and significantly strengthened the case against him. As the inquiry continued, police became increasingly doubtful of Ian's account after he reported Helen missing. One detail stood out in particular. He left the country for a holiday in Spain. For investigators, that choice was hard to understand given that his fiancée was missing. Ian's absence from search efforts along with his limited involvement in helping police only added to their concerns. When he returned, officers questioned him about his movements and the growing inconsistencies in his story. During those interviews, detectives noticed that Ian struggled with basic details about Helen. He couldn't recall things like the color of her eyes or even the address of their holiday home. Those gaps didn't sit well with investigators and pushed him firmly into the role of a person of interest. By July 11, 2016, police believed they had gathered enough evidence to act. Ian Stewart was arrested on suspicion of murder. The decision came after months of investigation that highlighted his unusual behavior, the timing of his trip abroad, and repeated contradictions in his statements. At the center of it all was money. Investigators concluded that Ian's attempts to take control of Helen's finances shortly after she disappeared pointed to a strong and deeply troubling motive. Ian's arrest marked a clear shift in the investigation. As the case moved forward, it became increasingly obvious that police were no longer looking at him as a grieving partner, but as the main suspect. On July 15, 2016, officers made a major breakthrough. Acting on new information, police searched Ian Stewart's home at Royston Hartwell Lodge. There, beneath the garage, they discovered a cesspit that had been sealed with a concrete slab. Inside were human remains. Those remains were identified as Helen Bailey and her dog, Boris. The location and condition of the cesspit made one thing clear. This wasn't accidental or improvised. It had been deliberately concealed, and the bodies could not have been accessed without digging. By that point, police had already been troubled by inconsistencies in Ian's statements and his behavior after Helen disappeared, which is why their attention had narrowed in on the property in the first place. Once the remains were found, forensic teams moved quickly. An autopsy showed that Helen had been given Zopicone, a sleeping medication often prescribed for insomnia. The drug was present in her system in a way that indicated she had been unconscious before she died. Examiners also found evidence of suffocation. Together, those findings helped establish how and when Helen died and directly tied Ian Stewart to her death. The discovery confirmed what many feared, but it also gave police the solid evidence they needed to move the case forward. The investigation officially shifted from a missing person inquiry to a murder case with Ian at the center of it. The following day, on July 16, 2016, Ian Stewart was formally charged. The charges included murder, obstructing justice, and preventing a lawful burial. He was taken into custody as the seriousness of the case became clear. On July 19, 2016, Ian Stewart appeared in court for the first time at St. Albans Crown Court, bringing the investigation into its next phase. At this first hearing, the charges were formally read out in court. Prosecutors laid out the evidence they had gathered, including forensic findings and witness statements that they said tied Ian Stewart directly to Helen's disappearance and death. It was the start of what everyone knew would be a long and complicated legal process. The prosecution made it clear they were treating the case with the utmost seriousness. They told the court they intended to seek a conviction, pointing to what they described as strong and consistent evidence linking Stewart to Helen's murder. By August 2016, the focus of the investigation shifted even more toward motive. Investigators took a close look at Ian Stewart's financial dealings, reviewing his communications with banks and other financial institutions. They wanted to understand how much he knew about Helen's wealth, which was valued at over £3 million, as well as her life insurance policy worth $1.28 million. What they found suggested that Ian was fully aware of the extent of Helen's finances. Prosecutors would later argue that this knowledge gave him a clear financial incentive. On October 12, 2016, Ian Stewart returned to St. Albans Crown Court for a plea hearing. He entered a not guilty plea to all charges, including murder, obstructing the course of justice, and preventing a lawful burial. With that plea, the court scheduled a full trial to begin in January 2017. By choosing to contest the charges, Stewart set the stage for a detailed trial. His defense team began preparing to challenge the evidence and the conclusions drawn by investigators. The trial officially began on January 9, 2017, again at St. Melbourne's Crown Court. On the first day, both sides gave their opening statements outlining how they believed the evidence should be understood. Prosecutors made serious allegations. They told the jury that Stewart had been giving Helen Zopicone over an extended period, gradually weakening her. According to the prosecution, this left her unable to resist or even breathe properly, leading to her death. They also said that after killing her, Stewart hid her body in a cesspit beneath their home. To support these claims, the prosecution began presenting what they described as key pieces of evidence. Prosecutors pointed to evidence showing that Helen's phone had connected to the Wi-Fi at the couple's holiday cottage in Kent shortly after she was reported missing. They argued this suggested Ian Stewart had been there after her disappearance, which raised serious questions about his role in what happened. They also highlighted a financial move made on the same day Helen vanished. The standing order from Helen's personal bank account into their joint account was increased from £400 to £4,000 a month. Prosecutors said the timing of that change was hard to ignore and pointed to a possible financial motive. On top of that, the court heard that Ian tried to gain power of attorney over Helen's finances soon after she went missing. Again, prosecutors said this showed an early and troubling focus on her money. One particularly striking moment came during testimony from Helen's brother. He told the court that Helen had once joked about the cesspit beneath their garage being a good place to hide a body. That comment took on a very different meaning once it became clear that her body was later found there. The prosecution also called a range of witnesses, including family members, friends, and forensic experts. Helen's loved ones spoke about how she had been in the weeks before she disappeared. Some raised concerns about her health, while others suggested that her relationship with Ian Stewart wasn't as smooth as it appeared from the outside. Forensic experts then explained the results of the autopsy. They confirmed that Helen had been given Zopicone and was unconscious at the time of her death, supporting the prosecution's claim that she had been incapacitated beforehand. In his defense, Ian Stewart told the court a very different story. He claimed that on the day Helen went missing, she had been abducted by two men. He said he didn't tell police right away because he believed it would protect her and that the men had demanded a ransom of £500,000. The defense also tried to present Ian as a caring partner who was devastated by Helen's disappearance. Some witnesses suggested that the prosecution's case relied too heavily on circumstantial evidence and lacked direct proof tying him to the crime. But as the trial went on, repeated cross-examinations began to expose problems in Ian's account. Prosecutors focused on the inconsistencies in his version of events and his descriptions of Helen and their relationship. At one point, it emerged that Ian struggled to recall basic details about her, things like the color of her eyes or even the address of their holiday home. Those gaps stood out to the jury and became another key part of the prosecution's case. Those gaps in Ian Stewart's answers made him appear less believable and less genuinely concerned about Helen herself. The defense pushed back hard on this, arguing that the prosecution's case was built on assumptions rather than solid proof. They tried to cast doubt on witness testimony and repeated their claim that Helen may have been kidnapped, insisting that Stewart was being unfairly blamed. One of the most impactful moments in the trial came when the jury was taken to Hartwell Lodge. Seeing the property in person, including the cesspit beneath the garage where Helen and her dog Boris were found, gave jurors a clearer understanding of the evidence they had heard about in court. In their closing arguments, the prosecution walked the jury back through their case. They focused heavily on money, arguing that Ian Stewart had a clear financial motive. According to prosecutors, he stood to gain from Helen's life insurance policy and her sizable estate. They said this wasn't a sudden act, but something he planned carefully, drugging Helen with Zopicone to render her unconscious before killing her. The prosecution described Stewart as someone who outwardly appeared caring and devoted, while privately acting in his own financial interest. They argued that his actions after Helen's death, both financially and in his behavior, supported that picture. The defense, in their final remarks, stuck to their alternative explanation. They maintained that Ian Stewart was not responsible for Helen's death and repeated the claim that she had been taken by unknown attackers. They told the jury there was no direct evidence linking Stewart to the crime and accused the prosecution of relying too heavily on circumstantial evidence. After hearing everything, the jury reached their decision. On February 22, 2017, Ian Stewart was found guilty of murder. The verdict confirmed the prosecution's case that Helen Bailey's death was driven by financial gain and carried out deliberately. The following day, February 23, 2017, Stewart returned to St. Albans Crown Court for sentencing. The courtroom was filled with family members, friends, and others connected to the case, all waiting to hear the judge's decision. During sentencing, Judge Andrew addressed the court at length. He described Ian Stewart as manipulative and calculated, saying the evidence showed clear planning. The judge made it clear that money was at the heart of the crime, stating that Stewart had deliberately set out to exploit Helen's wealth for his own benefit. After those remarks, Judge Bright sentenced Ian Stewart to life in prison with a minimum term of 34 years. The sentence reflected how serious the crime was and the level of planning involved. The judge also spoke about the risk Stewart could pose in future relationships, particularly to women. The long minimum term was set to make sure he would spend a substantial amount of time in custody before any possibility of release was even considered. After Stewart was convicted of Helen Bailey's murder, police began looking more closely at the death of his first wife, Diane Stewart, who had died in February 2010. At the time, her death had been ruled an accident, but details raised during Helen's case led investigators to question that conclusion and reopen the matter. Officers wanted to know whether there was a pattern to Stewart's behavior that had gone unnoticed for years. On July 6, 2020, Ian Stewart appeared again at St. Albans Crown Court, this time charged with Diane Stewart's murder. His defense followed a familiar pattern. He denied responsibility and gave conflicting explanations about how Diane had died, much like he had done during Helen's trial. The jury didn't accept his account. He was found guilty of Diane Stewart's murder as well. On February 9, 2022, Stewart was sentenced to life imprisonment with a whole life order, meaning he would never be released. That sentence was later reviewed by the Court of Appeal and reduced to a minimum term of 35 years. The case of Helen Bailey, formally concluded in July 2022, remains a stark example of betrayal and manipulation and the devastating consequences of an abusive relationship. Ian Stewart's actions not only ended the life of a respected and much-loved author, but also exposed a disturbing pattern that ultimately led to 2 murder convictions. In the end, the courts delivered their final judgment. Ian Stewart was convicted of Helen Bailey's murder on February 22, 2017, and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 34 years. He was later convicted of Diane Stewart's murder on February 9, 2022, receiving a sentence that ensures he will spend decades behind bars. It's a case that leaves behind difficult questions, not for speculation, but for reflection about trust, warning signs, and how much harm can remain hidden until it's too late. If you found this case fascinating, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. We post crime case videos every night. Until next time, stay safe, stay vigilant.